Johnny Carson was the most guarded man in America, yet on this night he handed a fragile, decades-old envelope to his guest, Jimmy Stewart, asking him to read the contents aloud. That envelope held the last thoughts of Carson's best friend, lost in World War II, and the reading forced the king of late night to face his deepest sorrow. The 3 final words Stewart read delivered the ultimate heartbreaking absolution and broke Carson's composure forever. Jimmy Stewart, the legendary Hollywood star, took his seat next to Johnny Carson, and the air in Studio One immediately softened. Stewart carried the reputation of a true gentleman, an icon whose inherent decency was matched only by his distinguished military service in the Second World War. His famous, gentle drawl and self-effacing humor were a balm to the audience, making him feel less like an untouchable star and more like a beloved uncle. On this particular night in the 1980s, the atmosphere was already sentimental, keyed to honor Stewart's commitment to duty and nation. Ed McMahon's laugh, usually booming, was respectfully muted, reflecting the profound reverence the entire studio felt for the man. Yet, as the interview began, Johnny Carson, the master of control, appeared subtly, profoundly unnerved. His famous, sharp wit seemed dulled, his questions perhaps too formal, his eyes betraying a restlessness that had nothing to do with the conversation and everything to do with the man sitting 3 feet away. Johnny was a meticulous professional, but tonight his hands gripped the edge of the desk with an unusual intensity. He was known for being emotionally impenetrable, guarding his private life and his feelings with a ruthless precision honed over decades in the unforgiving spotlight. No one, not even Ed, knew the depths of the sorrow he carried, the kind of sorrow that only comes from deep, unresolved guilt. Stewart, in contrast, was perfectly relaxed. He spoke softly about his life, his family, and his genuine pride in his military service, deflecting praise with characteristic humility. He embodied the heroism that Johnny had watched march away years ago, heroism that seemed to mock the comparative frivolity of a career built on joke delivery and celebrity interviews. Johnny, who had always defined himself by the success he achieved, felt a stark, painful contrast between the authenticity of Stewart's life and the constructed artifice of his own. The audience, sensing the unusual tension that shimmered beneath the surface of the polite conversation, leaned forward. They were witnessing a collision of 2 American icons, one built on quiet, public grace, and the other built on guarded, private ambition. Stewart represented the road not taken, a path of moral certainty that Johnny felt he had abandoned long ago for the dazzling, but ultimately hollow, lure of fame. It was a secret sorrow that Johnny thought was buried in the past, but the simple, gentle presence of the veteran star was about to act as the key, unlocking the emotional vault Carson had spent his entire adult life trying to secure. Johnny looked at Stewart, his gaze heavy with an unspoken truth. The stage was set for the deepest, most personal confrontation of Carson's career, and the man who would inadvertently trigger it was still smiling, oblivious to the decades of suppressed history he was about to unleash. The interview was gliding along, all surface charm and easy smiles, but beneath the desk, Johnny Carson's hands trembled with the realization that the man sitting across from him was intimately connected to the single, most painful regret of his entire life. The stage, usually a sanctuary of control, was about to become a place of unwanted reckoning. The real tragedy of Johnny Carson's success was not the fame he achieved, but the unspoken grief he locked away to achieve it. A sorrow so profound he hadn't allowed himself to fully feel it in 4 decades. The grief belonged to a young man named Danny Miller, a childhood friend from Nebraska who possessed an unshakable belief in Johnny's talent. Danny was the co-conspirator, the first audience, and the quiet mentor who convinced a nervous, ambitious young John Carson that his destiny lay far beyond the Midwest. Their shared dream was forged in freezing radio studios and small-town magic shows of the early 1940s. Danny always promised that one day he would see his friend's name in lights on the biggest stage in the world, a promise Johnny had fulfilled 1,000 times over, but always carried as a burden of guilt. That burden originated in 1944. Just as Johnny landed his first real local radio job, a chance to begin his ascent, Danny enlisted to serve his country, seeing duty as an unavoidable necessity. On the eve of his departure, Danny made Johnny promise 2 things. First, that he would never stop chasing the biggest stage possible, and second, that he would never, ever forget where he came from. That farewell was the last time Johnny saw his friend. Word arrived months later that Danny had been lost overseas, a sudden, brutal finality that left Johnny alone with his burgeoning ambition and an overwhelming sense of profound, personal guilt. Johnny often questioned whether his pursuit of fame was worth the price of that single foundational friendship. He buried the grief deep beneath the veneer of Carson cool, using success as a shield to avoid confronting the vulnerability and regret the loss represented. His emotional guardedness, the famous wall he built around himself, was ultimately constructed to protect the painful 18-year-old boy who felt he had abandoned his friend for a microphone. Now, sitting just a few feet away, Jimmy Stewart, the decorated wartime pilot, the humble hero, served as a living, breathing accusation. Stewart embodied the sacrifice Johnny had only witnessed from afar, and his very presence magnified the internal conflict Carson had suppressed for a lifetime. Johnny knew that the man across the desk was a physical link to a history he could not outrun, a history that included Danny. Worse, Stewart's decorated past made Carson fear the ultimate coincidence, that Stewart, as a senior officer in the field, might have actually known Danny Miller. That terrible, lurking suspicion added a layer of profound anxiety that made the air feel thin. The conversation continued politely about Stewart's latest movie, but in Johnny's mind, the timeline had collapsed. He was no longer the successful host of the 1980s. He was the guilt-ridden young man of the 1940s, forced to choose between the safety of Nebraska and the promise of a life that would ultimately cost him his best friend. He waited, taut and silent, for the other shoe to drop, fully aware that the quiet, gentle man sitting beside him held the unspoken key to the deepest sorrow of the king's heart. Johnny's agitation was a private alarm bell ringing across Studio One, one that only he could hear. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this segment was about to detour wildly off script, forcing him to face the ghost of Danny Miller. He just needed a way to bring the connection forward, to force the confrontation he simultaneously dreaded and desired. The polite discussion about Hollywood wrapped up, but Johnny wasn't ready to go to commercial. He had to move to stop the churning inside him, and finally force the issue he had spent 4 decades avoiding. With a sudden, decisive motion, Johnny rose from his desk. He returned a moment later, holding something small, rectangular, and fragile, a yellowed, sealed envelope that looked utterly out of place amidst the sparkling television set. He held it carefully, as if it contained glass. "Jimmy," Johnny began, his voice oddly soft, signaling they were entering personal territory. "Forgive me, but I have a prop here that wasn't in the rundown. This was mailed to the studio specifically for you, but the paper, it looks very old." He placed the envelope gently on the desk. The truth was, Johnny had intercepted the envelope weeks earlier, recognizing the sender's handwriting. He had carried the note in his desk drawer, utterly paralyzed by the deep, pervasive fear that it contained Danny's written condemnation, the final, brutal judgment on his chosen life of fame. He couldn't open it himself. He feared the words would end him emotionally. "I think it's more than that," Johnny confessed, shaking his head. "I think it's a promise, but I couldn't bring myself to open it." He paused, avoiding Stewart's eye. "Jimmy, I have a selfish request. Your voice, it carries such warmth and honesty. Would you do me the favor, would you do us the favor of reading this, whatever it is, right here, right now?" The audience was instantly captivated. Stewart, recognizing the genuine, deep-seated anxiety in Johnny's eyes, knew this wasn't mere show business. The king of late night was deferring his authority, asking Stewart to be the necessary shield against a personal history he couldn't face alone. Stewart nodded, accepting the immense, unspoken responsibility. He picked up the envelope again, examining the crude, hurried address scrawled across the front. The paper was brittle, holding the weight of decades. "All right, Johnny," Stewart said softly, his deep voice carrying an immediate sense of gravity. "Let's see what old promise we have here." He carefully placed the envelope on the desk, ready to break the seal that had held a secret captive for 40 years. The entire studio held its breath as Jimmy Stewart, with agonizing slowness, raised the fragile, yellowed paper to his eye level. He was about to break a seal, but Johnny knew, deep in his core, that the envelope contained the unspoken judgment of the friend he had lost. The gentle sound of Jimmy Stewart carefully breaking the seal on the fragile envelope was amplified by the studio microphones, echoing like a breaking promise across the vast, silent room. It was the sound of decades rushing back to collide with the present, a sound that only Johnny Carson truly understood. Stewart unfolded the thin, worn paper, handling it with reverent slowness. Before reading the body of the message, he instinctively checked the sender, squinting slightly at the faded ink. "Well, Johnny," Stewart said quietly, "the note is signed by a fellow named Danny Miller." The name landed like a physical blow. Johnny's face, usually masked by a flawless layer of professional cool, drained of all color instantly. The narrator reveals that Danny Miller, 1944, was the ghost that had haunted Johnny Carson's success, the foundational sorrow he had spent his life building an emotional fortress against. The appearance of the name felt like an immediate divine judgment. Stewart, still oblivious to the gravity, continued to examine the paper. "There's an old faint postmark here from Omaha, Nebraska. It looks like it was dated early December, 1944. The date was a crushing detail for Johnny. This was a final message, created just weeks before Danny was lost overseas, delivered 40 years too late. Johnny grabbed the edge of the desk, his knuckles white, fighting desperately to maintain control. He feared the note contained not gratitude, but the final, written judgment he had always dreaded, that he had chosen the spotlight over his friend. He desperately wanted to stop Stewart, but the moment had passed. Ed McMahon, watching his friend's unusual pallor, leaned in, ready to intervene, but a subtle shake of Johnny's head stopped him. Johnny was silent, submitting entirely to the past. The simple, fading name, Danny Miller, hung in the air, connecting the glamorous stage to a muddy war zone and a lifetime of regret. The silence of the studio was thick with expectation, waiting for Stewart to reveal the contents of the final communication from a man Johnny Carson could never forget. Was there a time in your life when you suddenly had to face a forgotten memory that changed your perspective? Drop a comment below and share your story of an unexpected, profound revelation. The simple name, Danny Miller, was the detonation point, immediately pulling Johnny Carson back across 4 decades to the snowy streets of Omaha and the sacred pact forged with his dearest friend. Now, Jimmy Stewart was the unwitting host to a ghost story playing out on live television. We flash back to 1944. Young Johnny Carson, then barely 20, and Danny were inseparable co-conspirators in the pursuit of a dream that seemed impossible from Nebraska. Danny was not a comedian. He was a practical, kind soul who possessed an almost prophetic faith in Johnny's quick mind and brilliant timing. They shared cheap apartments and cold coffee, constantly sketching out routines and practicing card tricks in front of a mirror. Danny always promised that once Johnny made it to the big time, he would quit his job and dedicate his life to being Johnny's first fan club president. Their bond was tested when duty called. Danny received his deployment orders, and the timing was cruel. It came just as Johnny was offered a small but life-changing radio slot in a bigger city, the first real step toward his destiny. Their farewell took place in a drafty train station filled with the noise of steam and the sorrow of separation. Danny, seeing the desperate conflict in Johnny's eyes, the fear of leaving his friend versus the ambition he couldn't deny, had pulled the last $7.50 from his own wallet. "Take it, John," Danny insisted, pressing the meager sum into Johnny's hand. "You promise me you will buy yourself a better tie than the one he wore for Mrs. Harrison's party, and you promise me you won't look back. You are going to be a star. You just keep going." Danny's words were not a request. They were an order, a final act of mentorship, a transfer of belief. The true heartbreak for Johnny came months later when word arrived that Danny had been lost in the fighting overseas. The guilt was immediate and suffocating. Johnny felt he had chosen the microphone over his friend, believing that Danny perished, thinking Johnny had put his own selfish ambition first. That guilt became the bedrock of Johnny's intense discipline, his relentless drive for success, and his infamous emotional reserve. He built the entire Tonight Show kingdom not just on talent, but on a desperate, lifelong need to prove Danny's sacrifice was worthy of the success it birthed. And now, here was the name, 40 years later, preserved on fragile paper, confirming the profound and total cost of that long-ago dream. Johnny was connected to his past by the unwitting hero, Jimmy Stewart. The stage was silent, waiting for the true meaning of Danny's sacrifice to be revealed. The simple, honest history of a long-ago friendship hung between the two great men. Johnny, trembling slightly, knew that the next line Stewart read would contain either the forgiveness he had craved or the judgment he had carried in silence for 40 years. The past was no longer buried, it was demanding to be heard. The thin, fragile paper trembled slightly in Jimmy Stewart's hand, yet his famous voice remained steady as he began to read, transporting the entire glamorous studio back to a cold Nebraska night in 1944. It was the moment the secret sorrow Johnny Carson carried was finally given a voice. Stewart began with the familiar tone of a friend. "Dear John, I'm sending this as promised, though I suspect it won't get there until long after I'm gone." The simple word John instead of Johnny was enough to visibly rattle the host, confirming the intimacy of the letter. Stewart continued, his voice catching slightly on the worn paper. "I know you were worried about leaving for that radio gig, but you had to go. Don't ever look back." He read a line that only Carson would ever understand, a reference to their shared, humble beginnings. "I heard you on that local station, the one where they made you use the squeaky chair. I told the fellas here that one day you'd make those network phonies pay $1,000 just to hear that chair squeak again." The audience didn't understand the reference, but Johnny did. It was a private joke, a shared moment of ridicule against their small-town limitations. At that line, Carson's composure cracked visibly. He let go of the desk, lifting his hand to his face, his eyes welling up with a sudden, overwhelming memory. Ed McMahon, who had been watching his friend with a growing alarm, moved silently. He reached out and placed a large, comforting hand on the back of Johnny's chair, a physical shield offering silent, unconditional support. Leaning close, Ed spoke into Johnny's ear, his voice a low, steady rumble meant only for his friend. "I'm right here, buddy. You fought your way here. Now let him finish the fight for you." Stewart, sensing the profound emotional shift but still unaware of its total cause, paused briefly, his eyes fixed on the struggling host. He then looked back at the paper, continuing the final thoughts of the young man who had sacrificed his future for his friend's dream. "The biggest worry I have is that you'll get so famous you'll forget the simple stuff. The laughs in the cheap theater are just as important as the ones on the big stage." The lines were not judgmental, they were full of paternal pride and profound belief. This was the forgiveness Johnny had spent a lifetime seeking. The emotional weight was becoming almost unbearable. Johnny tried to lean forward, to speak, to stop the reading, but he was physically unable, paralyzed by the catharsis. The letter was giving him permission to grieve, affirming that his success was not a betrayal, but the fulfillment of a shared destiny. Stewart, realizing he was delivering something sacred, adjusted his breathing, preparing to deliver the final, devastating, 3-word core of the message. The entire studio held its collective breath. The final lines of Danny Miller's letter lay exposed on the desk. The atmosphere was unbearable, thick with the weight of 40 years of unspoken sorrow, waiting for the 3 simple words that would either fully redeem Johnny Carson or finally shatter him completely. The sight of Jimmy Stewart reading that long-lost note, causing Johnny Carson's composure to break, is a testament to the power of unbreakable friendship. If this profound emotional connection touched you, please share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the bonds of loyalty transcend time. Jimmy Stewart's voice, usually a gentle, effortless stream, suddenly hitched and failed entirely, his eyes widening in alarm as he looked up from the fragile note toward the struggling host. The 3 final words, frozen in time on the paper, were moments away from transforming a television show into a public confession of lifelong grief. Stewart instinctively glanced at the final line of the note, the line that contained the 3 words Johnny Carson had spent 4 decades waiting to hear. He took a deep, shaky breath, attempting to regain his professional composure, realizing that the message was more powerful than any performance. The entire studio was suffocatingly silent. The crew, the audience, even the band, all were paralyzed, witnessing the king of late night's internal walls collapsing in real time. Stewart finally lowered his gaze, his voice cracking with emotion as he read the simple, devastating affirmation written in the faded ink of 1944. You made it. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Johnny Carson's head snapped up. The final, desperate struggle for control instantly ended. The phrase was not a congratulations on ratings or wealth. It was the final, direct fulfillment of the pact they made as boys. You made it. Danny hadn't judged him for his ambition. He had confirmed the success, freeing Johnny from the guilt he had carried as a crushing physical weight. A profound, wrenching sob escaped Johnny's throat, ragged and entirely unamplified by the microphone. Tears streamed down his face, genuine, uncontrollable torrents that washed away the mask of Carson Cool forever. He pushed away from the desk, covering his face with his hands, his tall frame shaking with the violent release of 40 years of pent-up sorrow and regret. This was the moment the public saw the man behind the jokes, a man deeply scarred by loss, finally given permission to mourn. Ed McMahon reacted instantly, abandoning his chair and rushing to Johnny's side. He didn't speak. Ed simply placed his large hand firmly on Johnny's back, a silent, rock-solid presence shielding his friend from the entire world. It was a beautiful, unscripted display of loyalty. The booming announcer serving as the strong, silent anchor while his boss was completely shattered. Jimmy Stewart, his own eyes welling up, gently placed the note back on the desk. He looked directly into the lens of the camera closest to him and spoke quietly. "My God, Johnny, this is a promise kept. This is a sacred delivery." Stewart's simple acknowledgement validated the scene as the fulfillment of a soldier's duty, preventing the audience from seeing it as just a breakdown. The show had stopped, only the human connection remained. The king of late night continued to shake with the pure, devastating force of his grief, utterly unaware of the cameras, the ratings, or the audience. The three simple words, "You made it," had broken the dam, but they had also delivered the ultimate, selfless absolution that Johnny Carson had secretly craved for his entire career. The sight of Johnny Carson, the untouchable king of late night, collapsing into raw sobs on national television was a staggering breach of every professional rule. Yet the camera operators held their focus, recognizing a moment of profound, sacred truth. Ed McMahon's strong, supportive arm was the only thing keeping the host upright as the emotional storm broke over him. The silence that followed the three words was the heaviest Studio One had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of an audience waiting for a joke, but the silence of witnesses caught in the undertow of genuine grief. Tears flowed freely across the entire room. Doc Severinsen, the band leader, slowly lowered his trumpet, his head bowed, his own eyes wet. Jimmy Stewart sat still, holding the fragile note, his gentle face etched with deep pity and respect, understanding that he had delivered absolution rather than condemnation. For a full minute, the nation simply watched Johnny weep. It wasn't weakness, it was the powerful, cathartic release of a man who had successfully deferred grief for 40 years, convinced that his success was stained by the price of his friend's life. The tears were for Danny, the young man who never saw the promise fulfilled, and they were for the young John Carson, who finally had permission to admit how much the loss had injured him. The emotional shield had shattered, revealing the vulnerable core that only Danny Miller had ever truly known. Ed McMahon whispered something into Johnny's ear, words so low they were lost to the microphones, but clearly words of comfort and unwavering friendship. This was the beauty of the moment. The entire network machine stopped operating, yielding completely to the supremacy of human feeling. Finally, Johnny slowly pulled himself together, wiping his face with a trembling hand, retrieving a handkerchief from his pocket. He was still kneeling slightly, supported by Ed. He reached out to Stewart and managed to speak, his voice choked and hoarse, a raw sound the audience had never heard. "Jimmy, I'm so sorry," he managed, gesturing to the audience. "I didn't mean to do this to the show." Stewart leaned forward, his own voice steady with gentle authority. "No need to apologize, Johnny. We're all just people here. Sometimes a promise just needs to be delivered." Stewart gently pushed the note closer to the host. He picked up his own microphone, turning slightly toward the silent audience, and delivered the only commentary needed. "Folks, this is what happens when friendship, real, deep friendship, meets the bright lights of fame. It reminds us what truly matters." The applause, when it finally broke, was not for the host or the star. but for the man who finally allowed himself to be seen. It was the longest, most sincere standing ovation The Tonight Show had ever received, a collective embrace from the nation to its heartbroken king. The applause faded, but the moment's raw intensity lingered. Johnny, steadied by Ed's arm, knew he had to understand the final, critical piece of the puzzle. How had Jimmy Stewart, of all people, come into possession of Danny Miller's last words 40 years ago? The most important question of his life still needed an answer. Supported by Ed's strong hand, Johnny slowly rose, the raw grief receding just enough to allow the relentless showman to ask the one question that demanded an answer, the question of providence. He looked at Jimmy Stewart, whose own eyes were still red from the emotional force of the reading. "Jimmy," Johnny managed, his voice still ragged, Did you meet him?" "Danny Miller. How did you get that note?" The question hung between the two men, connecting the glamour of the stage to the grim reality of the battlefield's 40 years past. It was a question about fate, coincidence, and the impossible timing of the heart. Stewart nodded slowly, carefully smoothing the fragile paper. "Yes, Johnny, I did meet him. It was late 1944. I was a major then, flying missions, and your friend Danny was an enlisted man, a corporal, I believe, in a unit waiting to move up to the front." Stewart spoke with the quiet, measured tone of a man recounting a long-ago duty. "We were sheltering in a temporary depot. I was speaking to some of the men, trying to give them a word of encouragement. Danny approached me quietly." The audience and the crew leaned in, captivated by the devastating coincidence. Stewart, the decorated star, and Danny, the simple young man, had crossed paths in a muddy field in the middle of a global conflict. Stewart explained that Danny recognized him immediately, not as the famous actor, but as the humble aviator. Danny then confessed his anxiety about his friend, John Carson, who was chasing a comedy dream back home. Stewart paused, looking from the small note to the successful set. "Think of the cosmic irony, Johnny. Danny gave this to me, a major, the famous movie star, asking me to find a simple kid in Omaha. But I got so busy, I lost touch. Instead of me finding a small radio host, you grew up to become the king of television. You becoming the biggest star in the world was the only way this note could ever be delivered." Danny told me that he'd written this note to his friend, John. But he didn't trust the regular mail, and he knew he might not make it back to send it himself, Stewart revealed, his eyes locking with Johnny's. "He asked me if I ever came across a fellow named John Carson, a kid who was trying to make people laugh. Would I please deliver this, his final promise?" Stewart paused, the weight of the delayed mission heavy on his conscience. "He said he knew it was a long shot, but if I saw you, it meant you had made it. He perished a few weeks later. I tried to find John Carson on the radio after the war, but the address was too vague. I kept the note, Johnny, tucked inside my own personal logbook, thinking maybe one day fate would intervene." The staggering nature of the coincidence, that the note passed from a corporal to a major and then waited decades for the very moment the sender's friend decided to expose his secret grief, was overwhelming. The note had survived the war, the years, and the postal system, only to be delivered when Johnny Carson finally asked for it. It was the ultimate cosmic affirmation that Danny's final thoughts were indeed with his friend, and they were full of unconditional support. Stewart hadn't come to condemn, he had come 40 years later to deliver absolution. The guilt Johnny carried, the terrible sense that he had succeeded at the cost of his friend's life, was finally, mercifully ended. "Thank you, Jimmy," Johnny whispered, his voice trembling again, the formal distance gone. He leaned into Stewart, giving him a brief, heartfelt second embrace. He pulled back, smiling faintly. "Danny would be proud, Major. That was the perfect delivery." The final curtain of sorrow had been pulled back. The deepest secret of Johnny Carson's life was revealed, not by a reporter, but by a selfless messenger who honored a soldier's dying wish. The 3 words delivered by Jimmy Stewart had finally freed Johnny Carson from 40 years of silent grief. The story of this profound moment of grief and redemption is the true heart of Johnny Carson's legacy. If you want to know how this single moment changed the king of late night forever, hit the subscribe button now. The cameras finally cut, the house lights dimmed, and the applause faded, leaving a silence that felt heavier, more meaningful than any noise, the silence of two men who had just shared a spiritual homecoming decades overdue. Johnny Carson, still shaky but buoyed by the catharsis, didn't move toward the control booth or his dressing room. He walked immediately toward Jimmy Stewart and, with a gentle strength, reached out and embraced the older man. It was a long, profound hug, the meeting of two hearts that understood the true, quiet cost of duty and the sacrifice of personal life for the sake of a greater good. Ed McMahon and Doc Severinsen watched from a distance, recognizing the moment was too sacred to interrupt. It was a final, deep communion between the comedy icon and the humble hero, both veterans of a different kind of internal war. "Jimmy, you don't know what you just delivered," Johnny whispered into the quiet air. "That note, those 3 words, they were the only thing that could have ever lifted that weight. I finally have permission to mourn." Stewart stepped back, holding Johnny's gaze with that famously gentle sincerity. "The young corporal, Danny, was a fine man, Johnny. He wanted you to know that his sacrifice wasn't a failure, but a foundation. He wanted you to succeed without guilt. That's the real meaning of those words." Stewart's simple act of reading the note became the most important delivery of his career, far surpassing any line he ever spoke on film. The narrator reveals that in the days following the broadcast, Johnny Carson, the famously guarded host, was subtly but profoundly changed. The emotional wall he had built around himself, the fortress of Carson Cool, was finally porous. He started taking more time for reflection, treating his fame less as a shield and more as a temporary gift. The show remained brilliant, but his interactions became noticeably warmer, infused with a new depth of kindness that the audience felt, even if they couldn't articulate why. He had been given a second chance at emotional honesty. The shift was evident on air. The next week, when a new comedian froze during his set, Johnny didn't reach for a sharp joke. He simply walked over, sat on the edge of the stage, and spoke to the young comic quietly until the laughter returned. When a celebrity gave a dull answer, Johnny leaned in with genuine curiosity instead of deflection. The note had given him permission to be less perfect and more human on air. The 3 words, "You made it," became the ultimate resolution to Johnny's deepest life dilemma. His entire success was now validated not by the network's money or the audience's ratings, but by the unconditional belief of the one person he feared he had betrayed. The words were Danny's final, selfless affirmation that Johnny's life's work was worthy of the sacrifice it cost. Before leaving the studio, Jimmy Stewart gently folded the letter, placing it not in Johnny's hand, but in the breast pocket of Johnny's tuxedo, right over his heart. "Keep the promise, Johnny," Stewart advised softly. "Don't forget the laughs in the cheap theater." Johnny nodded, tears forming in his eyes again, but these were tears of gratitude, not grief. He knew the legacy of The Tonight Show wasn't in its ratings or its political jabs, but in the simple, unbreakable truth of friendship. The entire painful, chaotic moment had served one glorious, redemptive purpose: to free the king of late night to finally live and laugh without the crushing weight of unspoken sorrow. If this powerful moment of redemption touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories about the human moments behind Hollywood's biggest legends.